Thank you for joining us today for this period of Bible study. You know, the Bible tells us that we should be devoted to God. But many times people think that true devotion to God is not a good thing. Now we applaud it. We think it's a great thing to be devoted to someone else. For example, in 2 Samuel 15 in verse 21, there we find Ittai the Gittite was very devoted to the King David. Matter of fact, he says in that verse, "As the Lord lives, and as my Lord the King lives, surely in whatever place my Lord the King shall be, whether in death or life, even there your servant will be." There we find Ittai was so devoted to David that said, "Wherever you go, even if you're dead, I will be there with you." That's true devotion, isn't it? Now we applaud that devotion. Oh, that's a great thing to be that devoted to your king. But when it comes to devotion to God, oftentimes people say you should not be that devoted. I mean, after all, but yet that's what God requires. For instance, in Matthew 22 in verse 37, Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." Now that is true devotion. And yet sometimes today men would say devotion like that is not good. Well, that's just being like addicted. Now we often think addiction is not good at all. And so they would claim, well, that's just devotion. That's just addiction. You should not be that devoted to someone else because you're giving your whole life in service to someone else. But that's exactly what we want. When it comes to devotion to God, then we should give our whole life in service to God. In Ephesians chapter 5, the first 7 verses, we find Paul describes to us the extent of the devotion that we should have towards God. In verse 1, Paul said, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children." Paul said to be imitators of God. This means to behave so as to copy someone else. In other words, we need to live in such a way that we are literally trying to copy God. Do exactly what God would do. You know, we learn by imitation. When my youngest daughter was very young, she had some speech problems, and so we carried her to a speech therapist who got her to start talking more and saying the words more clearly. And when the speech teacher was teaching her, she would say, "Now you do exactly what I do." Even talking about how to form the mouth and to shape the mouth and where to put the tongue and everything to make the proper sounds. You see, we have to imitate someone else. Small children often imitate the behavior of their parents. It's not unusual for a son to be told that he is just like his mother or a daughter to be just like her mother. In the same way, then, Christians are to be like God. Now we might ask, well, why should we be exactly like God? I mean, after all, we're not God. We're just human beings. God is God. So how can we be exactly like God? And why should we even try to be exactly like God? Well, in chapter 4, verse 32, the verse just before 5:1, then Paul there said, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you." He gives them some characteristics that we should live, and he said the reason why you should have those characteristics is because God has forgiven us. You see, we are to imitate God because God has forgiven us, and we are his beloved children. We naturally try to imitate those that we love, those that we look up to and admire. If we really love them and admire them, we want to be more like them. Well, if we really love God and admire God and look up to God as we should, then we're going to try to be more like God. In other words, try to imitate God. Well, what form does this imitation take? Obviously, we cannot really be just like God, so what characteristics does that mean that we should try to emulate in our daily lives? Well, Paul continues in verse 2. He said we are to walk in love. Walk in love as Christ also has loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. We are to walk in love just as Christ loved us. Walk refers to all the activities of life in which we might be engaged. You know, Christians are known as God's beloved children. So what does it mean to walk in love? What kind of love? You know, many times people today don't even understand what love is. Well, Christ's love was a forgiving love. And the Jewish rabbis taught that we should forgive someone 3 times. But in Matthew 18, verse 22, Christ says, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Here a disciple asks him, how often should we forgive? And Jesus says, not 3 times, not even 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, he was not literally trying to count the number of times that you should give someone, but that means you forgive someone as often as they sin against you. Love, true love, knows no limits as far as forgiveness is concerned. A love that cannot forgive is not love. And then we also find that Christ's love was a sacrificial love. He sacrificed himself for us. Paul said in Romans 5, verse 8, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You see, true love is the ability to say no to yourself and give yourself up for someone else. Jesus did not love the people who deserved his love. He loved the sinners. He loved the outcast. Even when we did not in any way deserve the love of Christ, he still loved us so much that he died for us. But this love is not just a feeling. It's not just an emotional love. This type of love is one that acts. For instance, John wrote in 1 John 3, verses 16 and 17, by this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. And we also want to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? So what kind of love is this love that we should have towards God and our fellow man? It's a love that is willing to sacrifice. It acts. Even to the point that you're willing to lay down your life for your brother. Now, Christ is not, and John not really saying you have to literally die for someone else, although certainly that might be involved in it. But he gives an example from everyday life. And what does it mean to be willing to lay down your life? Well, suppose you see a brother in need. This is a brother. You know him. You know his situation. You know he has some things that he needs. But you don't have him. Well, then how does that love abide in you? How can you say you love him if you refuse to give him the things that he needs? We are to walk in love. Love also means you renounce some distorted forms of love. Verse 3, neither fornication and all uncleanness and covetousness, let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints. Some distorted forms of love that Paul mentions here is fornication and uncleanness. The world often excuses fornication and adultery because they say, well, that we're just making love. We love each other. We love each other so much that we cannot forego what we're trying to do. But you see, fornication and adultery is being unfaithful to your spouse. It cannot be love if you're being unfaithful to your spouse. It is really just self-centeredness. You're concerned about what you want, not what is good for anyone else. You're just concerned with what you want. Uncleanness is all forms of lasciviousness. And then it names covetousness. Now, you might wonder, what does covetousness or greed have to do with fornication and adultery? Well, we covet many things. Money, uncleanness, might be another person. But covetousness is another form of perverted love. It is acting in your own self-interest. It's a form of self-love. And Paul says covetousness is idolatry in chapter 5 and verse 5. Certainly it is not imitating God. And then in verse 4, he names some filthiness and foolish talking and jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. This would be some words which describe lewd, suggestive speech. Filthiness would be obscenity or vulgar words. Foolish talking would be words that we say without thinking of how they might impact those who hear. It'd be words by which we ridicule or expose others to contempt. Now, the world often thinks this is unimportant. Matter of fact, the world might even say, it's just talking. We're just joking. There's nothing wrong with good jokes. Now, I like good jokes probably about as much as anyone else. I can't necessarily tell good jokes, but I love to laugh at jokes. But when you bring someone down by your talk, that is not love. That is not just joking. You're hurting other people. And how can we be imitating God when we're using His name in vain or irreverently? You see, this walking in love and purity is a very serious matter because it will lead to eternal damnation. In verse 6, Paul said, let no one deceive you with empty words. Because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. You know, the world often says, well, these things are not very serious. I mean, we're just joking. We're just talking. But these vain words that Paul has just talked about and described, they are empty words or arguments designed to convince us that the things we just read in verses 3 through 5 are natural and harmless. You know, Satan from the very beginning had deceived people in appealing to our flesh and making empty promises. The world often says, well, it's just a natural desire. And since God made us and we have this natural desire, then how can it be wrong? Because after all, God put the desire within us. If it feels good, do it. How can it be wrong if it feels so good? Other people might say, well, we cannot really know what is right and wrong. You see, there is no truth to such arguments. Paul said, if we engage in such things, the wrath of God will come upon us. And then in verse 7 rather, Paul kind of goes back to what he just said in verse 1. He said, therefore do not be partakers with them. Verse 1, he said, therefore do be imitators of God. We are to be imitators of God and not be deceived by the empty arguments that sinners often use in order to try to justify their behavior. We are to be imitators of God. Be like God. Do not follow the world, but we follow the things of God. And we can rest assured that if we follow the things of the world, as Paul said in verse 6, the wrath of God will come upon us. We need to make sure that we're trying to follow God, even the point of imitating God. We hope that this lesson for a few moments will encourage you to try to live your life in more ways to be like God, to try to imitate God, to exhibit the characteristics of God in such things as love and purity. Thank you for your attention again, and I hope this will help you as you try to follow God.